Hello, I'm Sarah Coakley. I am a theologian and philosopher of religion and an Anglican and Episcopal priest, now based in the Washington, D.C. area. And this is the fourth video in a series devoted to the question of what is the good of the church? That is the theological question of what is called ecclesiology, the vision of the church that animates us. And I'm delighted today to welcome two colleagues and friends, scholars for whose work I have particular respect, who are going to help us think about the agonizing question of racism in the country in which we live, the United States, and its historic and contemporary manifestations, and how this affects the church, how the church has been implicated in it, and what the church can do to respond to it. And I'm very glad to introduce today, first, Professor Vincent Lloyd, who is Professor of Ethics at the University of Villanova, and also editor of the journal Political Theology. Welcome, Vincent.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. And then secondly, I'm going to be talking to Professor Jonathan Tran from Baylor, who is professor of philosophical theology there, and who is an expert on Asian American religion and its implications in this country. And I'm very glad to welcome you here, Jonathan. Thank you so much for being part of this discussion.
It's great to be with you today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Before we start, I want to refer back to some issues that have come up in our recent discussions in this series. In particular, our contemporary presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry, has taken a very leading role in discussing what is to happen in the face of the exposure of historic and contemporary racism in this country. And his Becoming Beloved Community project, which is based, as we've seen in the third of the series of videos here, in the theology of John chapter 15 in particular, is animating and inspiring a lot of what our church is trying to do. But also, the Episcopal Church is exposing through various teaching functions the historic collusion of the Episcopal Church and its bishops in racism, particularly through a project called Sacred Ground. And it's considering reparations from historic slavery. And also, in a very recent document that you can find online, the Episcopal bishops have come out with a covenant for reckoning with white supremacy as a house of bishops and as a church. And so it's in the light of all these documents and reflections that I seek to enrich them yet further with considerations from these two scholars, because I think that the thoughts that they are having are ones that are not front and center at the moment in the Episcopal discussion, but could greatly assist us in thinking further about what needs to be done and what can be done in a spirit of hope as well as a spirit of penitence. So let me come to Vincent Lloyd first. And Vincent Lloyd's work on what he calls Black natural law. He brought out a book with Oxford University Press in 2016 on that topic, is, I think, a topic that is underrated and not fully understood yet within the discussion of the church and the history of racism. And so, Vincent, I'd really just like you to tell us a bit about this. What is Black natural law? Why is it a topic that's been, as it were, occluded of late? You think it's been occluded pretty much from the beginning of the civil rights movement. And why is it freshly important for countering contemporary American racism, both within and outside the church?
Thank you again for having me, Sarah. This tradition of Black natural law is a style of Black political theology that we see in leading Black leaders in the US context from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century. And I think it's a invaluable resource for Christians and for secular Black activists thinking about how anti-racist activism can be oriented toward justice. Thinking back to figures like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, an Episcopalian with a really extraordinary life story, and through Martin Luther King, famously Martin Luther King Jr., invoking a higher law or God's law has been a central feature of Black political leaders. And it's not just a rhetoric of saying we should end slavery or end segregation because of God's law. There is a process of moral discernment that each of these leaders and a broader tradition in which they participate puts forward, a reflection on the image of God in the human that happens not individually, not at a university, but collectively, often in social movement organizing, and that leads from a collective reflection and discernment based in the image of God in the human to a reflection on the laws of the land and which of those mismatch the natural law that has been discerned, and then from that analysis into action, right, into a challenge to laws that run counter to the natural law that's been discerned through this process. And this ensures that Black political activism is oriented toward justice, a justice that is rooted in the image of God in the human, in a theological idiom, and justice that is in that way irreducible to secular political calculation. It's not just we want something for us, right? It is the law of God that we have discerned through the image of God in the human motivates us in this direction to challenge these particular laws. And that's an ongoing process, a process of reflection that changes over a lifetime, changes over time as communities' own discernment sharpens, as new information is added. And a process that, as I said, I think would be very useful to remember that tradition in contexts, whether they're secular or theological. And yeah, it's a tradition that has been forgotten.
I think some people may be puzzled at this point, so let me speak for them, because we have plenty of rhetoric about justice, rights, indeed liberation. And yet I think you're saying that there's something here in the very notion of natural law, which is closely contiguous to these other notions, but which has been in danger of being pushed on one side. Can you specify more particularly what's being lost when the idea of natural law, this idea of our being formed in the image of God and all that that means in terms of mutual respect, why is that different from a focus, for instance, on secular rights, which took over very much in the latter 1960s period and onwards?
It's a great question. When we think about rights talk, we often think about a consensus that humans share or are supposedly share about what each of us is entitled to, that can then be implemented by states or by the United Nations or other actors. Whereas when we think about natural law, right, we think about individuals and collectives at the most basic level, right? Often in social movements who are discerning, reacting to forms of domination, grappling with the image of God in the human. And through that process of grappling, of struggling with the image of God in the human, gaining greater clarity about what God's justice is and what it requires. And as that clarity comes about, action comes about at the same time through the same sort of smooth movement from reflection to action. So this isn't a sort of static set of rights that one could list and then implement everywhere at all times, but rather a process that grows from grappling with domination, reflecting on the image of the human, and then discerning God's law.
So I think what you're pointing to is, ecclesiologically speaking, to use our jargon, the idea of a church that's semper reformanda, always reforming itself dynamically, moving towards a better future in the light of the mutual trust that should arise from the idea that we're all made in the image of God. Is this right? And you also draw attention in your wonderful book to how in the Black natural law tradition, this involves a really important integration of emotion with reason, and a very practical ongoing commitment to transformation and change, which gives it a great deal of kind of hopeful, positive, future-oriented animus, one might say. Is that right? Have I got you right here?
Yes, certainly. And there are times when natural law is invoked now, when natural law means reflecting on human nature, but human nature is reduced to the human capacity to reason. Mm-hmm. And we know that to be human is more than to reason, right? The essential characteristic of the human is not only to reason, although reasoning is certainly part of that, to reason, to feel, to imagine, to process. There are all sorts of aspects of the human that on which reflection is required in order to get to natural law, and on which reflection is required in order to understand how the image of God is rooted in the human. And ultimately, there's a mystery there. Ultimately, we can't just add up these 4 qualities of the human and say that's where the image of God is, right? There's something that always exceeds our capacity to name the human, which is the essential mark of the human, which is the way that the divine is imaged.
So I think what you seem to be suggesting, this is very exciting to me as an Episcopalian, is that natural law traditions are not just unitary. It's not just that natural law is static, as might be presumed, for instance, by looking at the most exemplary forms of it in the scholastic tradition, for instance, in the West. But that, as in the tradition of Richard Hooker that we've discussed earlier in this series, in the very early 17th century, end of the 16th century, there's an idea that natural law could itself have a sort of dynamic feature, that it's not just relativistic, but it has a history, and it is located and contextualized in particular projects, particular political, theological interests. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah, and I think it is so important to step away from the politicized and quite partisan of invocation of natural law as it's been used in the last few decades in US politics, and remember that there are multiple natural law traditions and complexities within them. There's not only Aquinas, but there's also Bonaventure, there's also as Sarah was saying, there's not only Aquinas as a theorist of reason, but also Aquinas who cares about narrative, who cares about emotion, right? There's complexity within of these sorts of figures. And then there are also these other traditions like Black natural law, which have often been overlooked, but have within them an appreciation for the complexity of the human, an internal development, an internal logic, these sort of characteristic features of a moral tradition, and which really ought to have more attention and more sort of persuasive force for us now.
Could you say in closing just a little word about this extraordinary person, Anna Julia Cooper, who is Episcopalian, was a member of the St. Luke's parish in DC, which was the first Episcopal parish. She sat at the feet of Alexander Crummell, who was the first rector there, who got turned down to be formed at General Theological Seminary because he was Black, but went on to have enormous impact. I think many people sort of wouldn't realize how important her influence was, and how significant she is, lying in the background even of Martin Luther King's letter from prison in Alabama, where he invokes natural law in the same way.
Mhm. Yes, Anna Julia Cooper is a really extraordinary individual and Episcopalian. She lived to be more than 100 years old. She was born enslaved. She never knew who her father was. Likely it was her former owner. She eventually went to St. Augustine's high school with this great tradition of African-American connection to St. Augustine, and to college, became an educator, and saw her own political activism happening through education, in part through education, through high school teaching, through eventually directing, being the president of a university that was focused on educating working class Black Americans in the DC area, providing them with a holistic kind of education, and then continued her studies. Was frustrated that she couldn't receive a PhD from a US university, so went to the Sorbonne in France, wrote a dissertation in her 60s that was written in French on the Haitian Revolution, and really continued her pursuit both of wisdom and of justice throughout her really long life, and inspired many, not only locally in the DC area, but nationally as well. So she is certainly a figure who we should read more of.
Thank you so much, Vincent. And I think that gives us a lot of food for thought about a tradition that combines theological reflection on the image of God, a notion of mutual respect, mobilization of political change through dynamic interaction between rational and emotional impact. Can I turn now to Jonathan Tran? Because Jonathan, I think also in his recent work, in particular the book that's just coming out, also with OUP, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, is bringing to the table some really punchy reflections on racism in this country and its implications for the churches. So, Jonathan, in this book you just produced, you offer a very particular account of racism, and I think it may surprise people. What is it?
Well, let me start by saying what I think to be a kind of common and I think mistaken view of racism, one that I believe is all too convenient. That is, it's convenient for us to hold this view of racism. So in this view, racism is largely an individual affair. I'm possessed of, say, certain wrong or incorrect or inaccurate, ignorant beliefs about other people, maybe Latinx community folks or Black folks. And then out of these incorrect beliefs, then I start acting in inappropriate or unjust ways to them. The idea here is if racism stems from bad beliefs, then I merely need to correct my bad beliefs by so much access to multiculturalism or diversity initiatives or what have you. In this view, these individual beliefs sometimes rise to the level of systems, but they're primarily about individuals. Well, the view I espouse follows from the long tradition of the Black radical tradition. Vincent talked some about this. And this view thinks that the common view somewhat has it backwards, and conveniently so. And so what I try to argue in this book is that racism doesn't begin with individuals and sometimes rise to the level of systems and structures. Racism is a system built into structures. It's always systemic and structural. And out of those systems and structures produces racist individuals with racist beliefs and attitudes and behaviors. In this picture, then, instead of focusing simply on individuals, we need to focus on those structures and systems that produces individuals. Now, in this account, what racism is then is the use of racial categories, racial fictions, to justify domination and exploitation, right? We live in a world with extraordinary forms of dehumanizing inequality. We then use race as a category to justify that world. Instead of asking our world, why do some people not have access to basic healthcare, to education, to jobs? Instead, we blame them. It's the ultimate form of gaslighting. I drive around my city of Waco and I notice Hispanic communities in disrepair, And instead of asking, why do we live in a system that produces disrepair as their form of living, instead of asking questions about structures and systems, I blame them. I say it's something natural to them, something natural to their race.
Now, of course, all this may sound rather familiar, just as when I interacted with Vincent, I said, well, in the first instance, what you are saying sounds completely familiar. And yet I think you're onto something that is not quite on the table in the usual way. So lots of people now, including most of the people in the Episcopal Church, talk about systemic racism, which itself is a rather, I think, unexplained term often. It can be assumed to be a kind of spooky phenomenon that afflicts people in their unconsciousnesses, but is not really explicated in terms of empirical factors, legal, political, economic. So am I right in thinking that if what you're after here in what racism is, what is it that you're wanting to say about anti-racism that is different from what you hear a lot, especially in the churches?
Yeah, the current popular anti-racism on offer is entirely to individualist base. So on the one hand, it talks about structures and systems, but it goes through what I call recitals of white guilt. The point of which is anti-racism is to get white people to feel bad about themselves, which to me, unfortunately, simply reinforces the idea in white people's minds that the most important thing about who they are is that they're white, which is precisely the kind of thing white supremacy wants them to think anyways. One of the most common ways this is expressed is in the often well-intentioned practices and work, an agenda of diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. And many corporations, institution, profit, nonprofit, churches certainly go through these trainings. And those trainings often begin with the idea of structures and systems, but they end by recitals of white guilt, white people feeling bad about who they are, about their history, about their participation in unjust systems. Some of that is certainly right. Certainly white supremacy is carried forth by white individuals who are advantaged and privileged by them. But in this recital of white guilt, amazingly, what gets untouched at the end of the day is we get a lot of white people to feel guilty about themselves, and maybe on the other side, virtue signaling their anti-racism. What gets untouched, though, is the structures and systems that just keep on going on and on. And part of this is because DEI culture emerged, right, in the 1970s and 80s in American life, at the same time that social justice, racial justice movements were decoupling from structures and system, at the same time, coincidentally, as the emergence of neoliberal capitalism. And so right at the right moment where we needed focused attention on the structures and systems, DEI often turned us away and had us focus on individuals. Now, these are really well-intentioned people. The question is, how do we get back to the attention of structures and systems that then illuminates how individuals operate in the world?
Could you then explain how your strongly political and economic approach to racism differs from a Marxist analysis, which it certainly sounds close to?
Sure. And admittedly, I borrow a lot from the Black Marxists, right? The Black Marxists were folks who said, of course, it's not about us. Of course, it's about structures and systems that want to exploit and make use of our bodies, render us into labor and property, get away with forms of land theft. What these folks showed is that the emergence of capitalism, capitalist domination in our country were co-emerging principles with chattel slavery, land theft, colonization, imperialization. These were processes that emerged in the modern world at the same time as the production of the modern world. And so this is at the same time these categories are being produced, these processes of domination, you're seeing the exploitation of Chinese labor. You're seeing the rendering of humans into property, the extraordinary forms of horrifying exploitation of chattel slavery, land theft from indigenous peoples. At the same time, you see emerging from this capitalist modes of existence. And so what I'm trying to do is follow and learn from the Black Marxists, which are often referred to as the Black radical tradition, and see how that illuminates the current realities in which we exist. But my story at the end of the day isn't a political economic story alone, or simply is it a rehearsal of Marxism. It's a Christian story. I think that the story of exploitation and justification through the use of whatever category, say race or gender, is another way of telling the story of sin that Christians have been telling for a couple thousand years, which is we are created in goodness, we incline towards goodness, and in sin, we find ways to make our sin somehow less or more than sin. And so the story I've told about the exploitation using race categories maps directly onto the Christian story of sin.
So let's cut to the chase now, because what's so wonderful about your new book is that you actually explore in great ethnographic detail how a church in conditions of neoliberal capitalism can transform, resist, survive, find hope, and actually change the world. So this is a very, very interesting case where the good of the church is clearly connected with theological thinking, and theological thinking that pushes back against what is being taken for granted as natural, oddly, in the light of what Vincent's been saying, in a neo-capitalist system. A neo-capitalist system which produces many goods, but also unseen and often hidden ills. So tell us a bit about Redeemer Church.
Yeah, and whenever Christians, and particularly Christian theologians, get on about racism and anti-racism, we mount an incredibly difficult balancing act. On the one hand, we need to acknowledge not simply racism, but Christianity's deep complicity in racism, while also saying that that's not the only story, that's not the whole story, that God is not going to abandon the church, even if the church has given every reason through its historic and present racism to be abandoned. And so it's a conviction driving the book to say, well, what else might be happening? And so I focus on a church in what's called the Bayview Hunters Point part of San Francisco, which is the most marginalized part of the city of San Francisco, the site of extraordinary forms of environmental racism, employment racism, thievery against African Americans. It's a part of the city that's often referred to as Black San Francisco. And I describe a church that, at the invitation of the Black churches that have been there for decades, a church constituted by mostly Asian Americans, go and live in community with their neighbors. They follow the thinker, the activist, theologian, civil rights worker, John Perkins, and the 3 R's about relocation, redistribution, and reconciliation. And they imagine life with their neighbors in continuity. Now, they don't go in as saviors. In fact, they imagine themselves finding greater forms of joy there with their neighbors than they can elsewhere in the city. And they imagine their lives there as a form of repentance, of dispossession of privilege. And this banks on an account in Mark and Luke and Acts of the church, both redistributing and repenting of all the sins that grip their lives. And so out of this church creates a software company, because a lot of them are trained engineers from nearby Cal and Stanford. And the software company allows them to redistribute money into the community by supporting local businesses, local communities, local endeavors. And then part of this money is used to start a local school. The relationship between the school, the church, and the business, I call a microecology that is part of a larger ecology of Black churches in this community that's trying to say this, and this is the basic theological conviction, and this ties back to what Vincent was saying about the natural, is that the primary key of Christian witness in this world, especially in the face of extraordinary forms of injustice like racism, that the primary key of Christian speech is not resistance, it's proclamation. That justice and mercy are natural to the church because they're natural to God. I think that's part of what Vincent means by the complexities of natural law brewing up in an account of justice. And what we have in this church is a group of people who aren't making this stuff up. They're simply leaning into the way they think Scripture tells the story of the world.
Could you focus just a minute on those very specific passages in the New Testament that are important to them, because this links back to the first session in our series with Professor Richard Hayes on how the earliest church thought of itself as bringing in the new times. So as I understand it, Mark 10 is particularly important, right? As a passage 29 to 31, where Jesus is proclaiming a transformation out of familial patriarchal structures into something completely new and transformative. And then in the early chapters of Acts, we get this distributivist notion of how everybody shared their goods together for the good of all, and so on and so forth. Are these the main passages?
Yes, that, and in Mark as well, the story of the rich young ruler. And what you have in these stories is if you combine them, what you have is an account of God simultaneously creating a redistributive, just political economic order and the missional calling of the church. These are not distinct realities. We aren't, on the one hand, setting out missions as if to spread the gospel is to share some abstract reality. Rather, the spreading of the gospel is the reimagining of what humanity might look like, organized in the terms of justice and repentance made possible by cross and resurrection. And so the combining of, say, Luke and Acts, what's often just called Luke Acts by biblical scholars, is a story of a missional world, a gospel world that looks like justice, that looks like an inclination, a reordering, a dismantling of old things, and the bringing forth of a new humanity. It is reimagining the world.
And particularly in Luke, it's a theology of the poor as being lifted up, as we hear in the Magnificat, for instance, right?
The theology of the poor and a picture of the poor and the oppressed and the forgotten and the marginalized as where God is at. That's part of the new world, the reimagining of how we imagine our existence in this world.
And so what runs throughout your book is an implicitly strong critique of what you call identitarian views of racism, in which what really matters is what category you belong to, black, white, or whatever. But at the same time, an absolute resistance to the idea that we can be colorblind, which is often assumed to be the alternative in our political circumstances at the moment. And instead, a really rich ecclesiological vision of the transformation of these categories. Have I got you right here?
Yeah, and it is to say that identity and belonging matter. I mean, there are ways of imagining racial identity that push against the ways that racialization justifies domination. So Vincent's writing a book on, or finishing a book on Black dignity. It's the same kind of thing when Asian Americans, who, as we all know, have been victim to thousands of cases of anti-Asian American violence in the shadow of COVID, in the way that some of them have held up signs that says, "I'm not a virus." So identity does matter. But we also want to say, what are the ways in which identity and sites of oppression gather us in coalitional solidarity with other people? One of the Black Marxist radical tradition folks I'm really interested in my book is a figure named Oliver Cromwell Cox. And Cox showed that labor disputes in the 19th century, what they were supposed to do, not that they just accidentally did this, but what they're supposed to do is pit poor white people against poor Black people against poor Chinese people. And so at the end of the day, instead of looking at the systems and structures that were mutually but differently oppressing these various communities, these communities then just simply fought against each other as if they were to blame. Again, notice who gets away scot-free, the oppressors and the elites of a system of domination. And so we want to both name the particular ways in which we belong in communities and can resist, but also keep continuous sight lines to the global structures of domination and as well the global systems of liberation that God and the Spirit are always enacting in the world.
In the light of this discussion, I'd like to bring Vincent back and say, Vincent, so what is the good of the church? I know you're a political theologian, you're an ethicist, but if pushed, what would you say in the light of this discussion and in the face of our contemporary challenges?
First, I would recommend everyone to read Jonathan's wonderful book. Really important insights into the meaning of justice-oriented church today, and I've learned a lot from it. One of the other things that has struck me, we were talking about Anna Julia Cooper, when I went to Anna Julia Cooper's archive in the basement of the Howard University Library. I'd read about Cooper as a precursor to contemporary feminism, a theorist of intersectionality before that was a word. But what I found there was page after page of devotional poetry, right? A reflection on her formation in her church community. And when she was in France, she was writing about the icons she was seeing on church walls, right? And the stained glass windows that she was seeing. So I think that looking backward, about the question of the good of church, right? The sort of formation of an orientation toward racial justice in a church context, in an ecclesial context, I think is hugely important to remember. And looking forward, right, the sort of aspiration that church names, right, as something to bring a community into, rather than something that is empirically, rather than something that is only empirically existing, right? A movement toward justice that brings unexpected allies together in a shared vision. That is an inspiring vision, I think, of good of the church in the context of racial justice.
Thank you, Vincent. And so now I'm going to turn the tables on Jonathan. And what is the good of the church for you, Jonathan, as a result of your research and your perspectives?
Well, you think about the life of this saint that Vincent just described, about a person who's writing poetry and imagining God in words, or looking at a wall and imagining icons. In the Redeemer Church that I described in San Francisco, I'd say that all of the work that they do in this community flows out of their community, out of a common life, out of the old, ordinary, and often boring, mundane practices of the church, like prayer and Bible study and gathering and taking of the sacraments and being ordered into the world in a picture of the gospel. So it's this amazing structure, this political economic structure, what is often called in the old traditions of the church, the divine economy, that orders a people towards justice. And these are the tools that God has given us in the face of extraordinary forms of oppression and injustice.
Thank you so much, Vincent and Jonathan, for this rich discussion. And from all that I've learned from you and the ways that I've changed my mind in the course of recording these videos, in a last coda that I'm recording in a couple of days, I'm going to reflect on what I've learned through this whole series. And I want to thank you all for taking part. Many thanks today. Bye.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.